Hello, mathematicians. Today we're going to be learning about fractions and decimals, more specifically about ordering fractions, mixed numbers, and decimals by converting to decimals. To get us started, we have 8/10, 962 thousandths, and 9/10. Well, 8/10 is already a decimal, so we're going to go ahead and rewrite that. Then 962 thousandths is also a decimal, so we're also going to rewrite that. But 9/10 is a fraction. In order to write 9/10 as a decimal, we have to go ahead and divide the numerator by the denominator. And then ask ourselves, how many times does 10 go into 9? Well, 10 doesn't go into 9, so we're going to put a 0 here. Then add a decimal point after 9. And a 0 so we could keep dividing. Don't forget to bring up the decimal point. And then we're going to ignore this decimal point for a second and ask ourselves, how many times does 10 go into 90? Well, 10 goes into 90 9 times, and that's because 10 times 9 is equal to 90. So we're going to write the 90 there, and then we're going to subtract. 90 minus 90 is equal to 0. So we have no remainder, which means 9/10 is equal to 9/10. So now that we have all three values as a decimal, we're going to go ahead and compare. In order to compare decimals, we're going to line them up by place value. And notice that once we line them up by place value, their decimals are also lined up. That's another way to make sure that they're lined up by place value. So here we have our ones place, here we have our tenths place, then we have our hundreds place, and then we have our thousands place. Notice that some of these decimals don't have a number in the hundreds place value or a number in the thousands place value, so we can add zeros as place value holders to make it easier to compare. Now, looking at the ones place, they all have zeros, so it's difficult to compare that way. And then looking at the tenths place, we have 8, 9, and 9, which makes this one with the 8 the smallest number when we order it in order from least to greatest. So 8/10 is going to be our smallest value. Then we're going to compare the bottom two numbers. And in the tenths place, they both have a 9, but if we go ahead and look at the hundreds place, we have a 6 and a 0, making the number that's on the bottom the smallest one. So we have 8/10, and then we have 9/10, which was originally written as a fraction, 9/10. And then that would automatically make 962 thousandths the largest value that we have here. So let's do another example. We have 7/10, we have 3/4, and we have 752 thousandths. Now, 7/10 is already written as a decimal, so we're going to leave it as is, but 3/4 is not. So in order to make this fraction into a decimal, we have to go ahead and divide the numerator, which is 3, divided by the denominator. Then we ask ourselves, how many times does 4 go into 3? Well, 4 does not go into 3, so we're going to put a 0 there. And then add a decimal point after the 3, and then add a 0. Make sure you bring up the decimal point. And then we ask ourselves, by ignoring the decimal, how many times does 4 go into 30? Well, 4 goes into 30 7 times. And that's because 4 times 7 is equal to 28. And that's as close as we could get without exceeding 30. So we're going to take the 28 and write that underneath. And then we're going to subtract. 30 minus 28 is equal to 2. So because we still have a remainder, we're going to go ahead and add another 0 and bring it down. So then we ask ourselves, how many times does 4 go into 20? Well, 4 goes into 20 5 times, and that's because 4 times 5 is equal to 20. So we're going to write the 20 there, and then we're going to subtract. 20 minus 20 is 0. So there's going to be no remainder. That means that 3 over 4 is equal to 75 hundredths. Now we're going to take a look at 752 thousandths. And this is already a decimal, so we're going to go ahead and just rewrite the decimal. All right, now that we have all our values written in decimal form, we're going to go ahead, line them up by place value, and then compare. In order to make sure that we have our numbers lined up by place value, see if the decimal points are lined up. If they are, then they are lined up correctly by place value. So we have our ones place, we have our tenths place, we have our hundredths place, and we have our thousandths place. Notice that some of these values may not have our hundreds or thousandths place, so we're going to go ahead and add zeros as place value holders. So now we can go ahead and compare. If we look at the ones place, all of them have zeros, making it difficult to compare. Then we're going to go ahead and look at the tenths place. But they're all 7, so that makes it difficult to compare as well. And then we look at the hundredths place. We have 0, 5, and 5, automatically making 7/10 the smallest value because it has a 0 in the hundredths place, whereas the other numbers both have 5. Now, if you look at the bottom numbers, they both have a 0 in the ones place, they both have a 7 in the tenths place, they both have a 5 in the hundredths place, so we're going to look at the thousandths place, where we have a 0 and then we have a 2, so that means that 75 hundredths is our next value. And originally, we had that written as a fraction, which was 3/4. So that automatically makes 752 thousandths our greatest value here. So let's do another example. We have 5 and 2 over 3. We have 5 and 55 hundredths. And we have 5 and 1 over 2. Now, for 5 and 2 over 3, we have a mixed number. In order to convert it to a decimal, we're going to just take the fraction for right now and divide the numerator divided by the denominator. So 2 divided by 3. We ask ourselves, how many times does 3 go into 2? Well, it doesn't, so we're going to add a 0 on top and then add a decimal point after the 2. Then we add a 0, make sure you bring up the decimal point, and then we ask ourselves, how many times does 3 go into 20? Well, 3 goes into 20 6 times, and that's because 3 times 6 is equal to 18. So we're going to go ahead and subtract by 18. 20 minus 18 is equal to 2. And so because we still have a remainder, we're going to go ahead and add another 0. And we're going to bring that 0 down. Then we're going to ask ourselves again, how many times does 3 go into 20? Well, 3 goes into 20 6 times, and that's because 3 times 6 is equal to 18. So we're going to go ahead and put the 18 down here and subtract again. So 20 minus 18 is equal to 2. Then we still have a remainder, so we're going to add another 0 and bring it down. And we get 20 again. So we know that 3 goes into 20 6 times because 3 times 6 is equal to 18. We're going to write the 18 again, and we are going to subtract. Now we got 2 again, so there's a pattern here, okay? Our decimal is 0.666, and it's just going to keep repeating. So we're going to write that out as a repeating decimal. But be mindful that we didn't start off with 2/3, we had 5 and 2/3, so that means that 5 and 2/3 is equal to 5.6, where the 6 is repeating. Now, 5 and 55 hundredths, we could rewrite it as is because it's already a decimal, and then we have 5.5. So we're going to take the fraction, and we are going to divide. 1 divided by 2. We ask ourselves, how many times does 2 go into 1? Well, 2 goes into 1 0 times. So we're going to add a decimal point after the 1 and a 0. Make sure you bring up the decimal point. And then we are going to ask ourselves, how many times does 2 go into 10? Well, 2 goes into 10 5 times, and that's because 2 times 5 is equal to 10. So we're going to add the 10 there, and then we're going to subtract. 10 minus 10 is 0, so there's no remainder. But we didn't just start off with 1 over 2. We have 5 and 1 over 2, so 5½ is equal to 5 5/10. All right, so in order to compare these decimals, we have to line them up by place value. So we have our ones place, we have our tenths place, we have our hundreds place. Not all our values have a number in the hundreds place, so we're going to go ahead and add a 0. Now, in the ones place, we have 5 5 5, so we can't really compare that. In the tenths place, we have 6 5 5, automatically making this top number the largest one. So let's compare the bottom two. So the bottom two both have a 5 for the ones place, and they both have a 5 for the tenths place. But if we look at the hundreds place, we have a 5 and a 0, automatically making that last value our smallest one. So 5 5/10 was originally written as 5½, and that's our smallest value. Then we have 5 55/100ths, and then our largest value is 5 2/3, which is 5.66666, and it just keeps repeating. Okay? So let's do our final example. We have 7 and 7 over 20. We have 9 1/100ths. And then we have 7 and 8 repeating. Okay? Notice that this middle one has a whole number of 9 compared to this number having a whole number of 7 and this one having a whole number of 7, making this one automatically our largest number when we go ahead and compare. So we have 2 decimals here, but we have a mixed number, so we're just going to rewrite this as a decimal before we do anything. So we're going to go ahead and divide 7 divided by 20. We ask ourselves, how many times does 20 go into 7? Well, it doesn't, so we're going to add a 0 on top. Then add a decimal after 7 and a 0. And then make sure you bring the decimal point up. So now we could ask ourselves, how many times does 20 go into 70? Well, 20 goes into 70 3 times because 20 times 3 is equal to 60, and that's as close as we could get without exceeding 70. So we're going to go ahead and write the 60 and then subtract. 70 minus 60 is equal to 10. And so because we still have a remainder, we're going to add another 0, bring it down, and then ask ourselves, how many times does 20 go into 100? Well, 20 goes into 100 5 times because 20 times 5 is equal to 100. We're going to write 100 underneath, and then we're going to go ahead and subtract. 100 minus 100 is equal to 0, so we don't have a remainder. So 7 over 20 is equal to 35/100ths. Now we started off with 7 and 7 over 20, so 7 and 7 over 20 is equal to 7 and 35/100ths. Now here, this one's already a decimal, so we're going to just bring it down, 9 and 1/100ths. And then here, we have 7.8 repeating, so we're just going to rewrite it because it's a decimal. Now, because we have all our values written in decimal form, we're going to go ahead and compare. Make sure that all of them are lined up by place value in order for us to compare. So we have our ones place, our tenths place, and our hundreds place. In our ones place, we have 7, 9, 7, automatically making that middle number our greatest value. So let's compare the top one and the bottom one. Now in the tenths place, the top one has a 3, but the bottom one has an 8, automatically making 7 and 35/100ths our smallest value. and it was originally written out as 7 and 7 over 20. Then we have 7.8 repeating, and then finally we have 9 and 1/100ths. And that's it for comparing fractions, mixed numbers, and decimals by converting to decimals.